Social influences on action. A couple key vocab that you need to know. Obedience. Obedience is the act of obeying orders from others. Compliance. Compliance is behavior influenced by your peers. And then conformity is behavior intended to match that of the majority. So that is one that you guys should definitely be familiar with, that you've heard before. All right, so you act like other people around you. Those of you that have moved schools, and maybe the school is different than your old school, you notice that you start to conforming to the ways of your new school. Maybe the way you talk, maybe the way you dress. And a lot of people say they don't, but majority of people do conform, even when they're not trying to. So conformity, when people interact in groups, there are specific psychological effects that happen. So conformity, like we talked about, is one of them, right? The tendency for people to adapt the behaviors and attitudes and opinions of others, members of a group. Right, so the cartoon just says, suddenly Professor Leibowitz realizes he has come to the seminar without his duck. So normally you wouldn't go to the seminar without a duck, but if you see everyone else in the group with a duck, you'll be like, oh, where's my duck? I need a duck. The Ash effect. So there's a few social psychological experiments that were done that you need to be aware of for this unit. So the one was done by Ash, Solomon Asch. So the Ash effect says the form of conformity in which a group majority influences individual judgments. So what happened was, he did all these trials. The original one, he had 4 trials, 7 people in each trial, and I could show you a video of what it looked like. And then they were shown a card that looked like this, right? So you see this black card right here. They were shown a card like this. 6 people were aware of what was going on, and the one person wasn't. And they would ask them, so you have Exhibit 1 right here. Which one, A, B, or C, matches Exhibit 1? And they would do like the 3 trials, and they would all get it right. Well, on the 4th trial, they would everyone would say the wrong answer, right? So even though they know it was A, they would all say, like, let's say B. And then all of a sudden you get to the last person, so everyone else is in on the experiment, but the last person isn't. And they're looking around and they're like, I think it's A, but everyone said B. Man, it must be B. So they choose B, right? And that shows how people conform. And a lot of people actually did choose the wrong answer just to conform with the group. So the results, 75% of those subjected to group pressure conform to the false judgment of the group 1 or more times, while only 25% remain completely independent. Right? So there's group pressure. Even though the people weren't saying anything to them, you have the people looking at you and you feel that pressure. If you remember when we talked about peer pressure back during the brain unit, we talked about how peer pressure isn't just, or the developmental unit, one of those two, but peer pressure isn't just, your peers telling you, hey, do this, do that. It's just them, their presence being around you. So there was that one article where teenagers tended to drive more reckless when they thought their peers were just watching them on the simulator. They weren't even watching them, just the thought of them watching them, right? So, group pressure doesn't have to be someone saying, hey, do this, do this. It's just them being present. So this, study had been repeated. And in related studies, they found that 50 to 80% conformed with the majority's false estimate at least once, while 33% yielded to the majority on half of the trials or more, right? Which shows that people conform, right? Even though we say we don't, we really do. Most of us, or maybe all of us to some extent. So some of the characteristics that promote conformity. So Ash identified 3 factors that influence whether a person will yield to group pressure. So, some people will yield to the pressure in some situations, but not others, right? So number 1, the size of the majority. So how big is the group that you're going against? If you have 100 people saying one thing and you think something else, then you might tend to conform. If it's just 1 or 2, you might not. Number 2, the presence of a partner who dissented from the majority. Once one person, kind of breaks away from the majority, then other people who might think that way might break away as well. And thirdly, the size of the discrepancy between the correct answer and the majority's opinion, right? Is it small or is it big? What you think and what the majority thinks. So that could influence you one way or the other. So conformity increases when you feel incompetent or insecure, right? So if you don't feel confident about whatever is going on or insecure about it, you're more likely to conform what everyone else is doing. If you are in a group of 3 or more people, if you are impressed by the status of the group, right? So think about Mean Girls, right? So Mean Girls, the movie, is like the ultimate social psychology movie, and it's one that we usually watch in class because it's all about conformity and stuff like that. So you see how they all conform. Remember when they were trying to prank Regina George and even like cutting holes in their shirts, and all of a sudden everyone else started, cutting holes in the shirts because they were the plastics. They were the Mean Girls, the popular group. Conformity also increases if you made no prior commitment to a response. So if you haven't committed one way or the other, then you're more likely to conform to the majority. If you've already made a commitment, then you're not as likely to break away from that. Next, if you're being observed by others in the group, all right, kind of like we talked about before, if other people are watching you, you're more likely to do what you think they want you to do. And then lastly, your culture strongly encourages respect for social standards. So different cultures, look at this differently. So some cultures are very traditional and they encourage, social norms, not breaking away from social norms. Other cultures are different than that. So if you see these, think about like cults. That's what people like in cults are looking for. They're looking for people who feel incompetent and insecure about themselves. Same thing with like terrorists, right? That's what they're looking for when they're looking to recruit these people to become like suicide bombers. They're looking for people who are incompetent, insecure about themselves because they are easy to manipulate. Next, obedience. All right, so Stanley Milgram, who was actually a student of Asch, knew that people complied with social pressures. There's actually a movie that was made a few years ago called The Experimenter, which if we have time, I'll actually be able to stream for you maybe after school one day. So he did a study where a person would shock another individual if they answered a question incorrectly. The voltage would increase the more questions one missed. So though most people said they would stop before any pain was inflicted on the other individual, 63% continued throughout the entire experiment because they were told by the experimenter that they must continue, right? So this shows how people are obedient. So you have one person shocking another person because they're getting questions wrong. They both signed up for it, right? They both said okay. They literally flipped a coin beforehand to see who was going to be the experimenter, or sorry, who's going to be the shocker and who's going to get shocked. And even though the person in the other room was screaming out in pain, the person kept shocking them because the authority figure, the person conducting the experiment, told them to. Right? So, even though they said they wouldn't do it beforehand, they still did. And so when we ask questions like, how could, certain people like the Nazis do what they did? Well, for a lot of them, this kind of answers that question. And this experiment was done, shortly after World War II. And it shows that if people are if they have authority over them telling them to do something, they do it whether they think it's right or not because that's what they're supposed to do. Groupthink. Groupthink is the mode of thinking that occurs when the desire for harmony in a decision-making group overrides a realistic view of the alternatives. So some of the factors that promote groupthink. We have isolation of the group, high group cohesiveness, directive leadership, lack of norms for procedures, members have similar social backgrounds, high stress from external threats. All right. So, groupthink is where people just kind of agree with everyone else just to kind of agree with them. And we see this. So, like if we're doing a group project and you have to kind of come up with a consensus about what's going on, and I say, okay, you got 3 minutes to finish up, you're going to more likely see groupthink because you're like, okay, we just have to agree on something, and so people agree on it whether they do or not. All right. If you get along, if you have similar backgrounds, you're more likely to agree with each other. If there's no necessary procedures um, for how things are supposed to get done, and one person takes charge, everyone else tends to agree with them. And as long as there's not isolation of the group is like as long as there are not other people around them influencing the decision. So think about where do you think see groupthink in your lives? Because we all see it. So think about that and be ready to share. So the cartoon says, obviously you got the guy in front, right? He's kind of like the leader, and he says, "We are firmly opposed to any form of groupthink." And everyone's like, "Right, JB, right, JB, right, JB." And obviously, what are they doing? That's just groupthink. Group polarization. All right. So when members of a group have similar, though not identical, views about a topic and discuss them, their opinions become more extreme and pronounced. Right. So the more you talk to someone that kind of thinks differently than you, and if you've ever been in a, had like a political discussion with someone and they are on the other side of the aisle, sort of say, and the more you start talking, a lot of times it starts getting more heated and you become more polarized, right? So, you know, George W. Bush, whether you liked him or didn't, during his 8 years of presidency, he was a very polarizing figure with what happened in the country at that time. Um, so you started seeing a bigger divide between the two parties. Uh, Now, I mean, maybe I should replace that um, picture with a more updated picture because obviously the Trump presidency divided the country even more, right? So when you start talking about things, we became even more polarized than before. Where actually George W. Bush, where he kind of went away during the Obama presidency, you didn't see much of him. He kind of came out during the Trump presidency and seemed a lot less polarizing than he once did during his presidency. So other group behaviors, right? You have social facilitation, tendency for improved performance of tasks in the presence of others. So this is generally because of a heightened state of awareness. So think about some examples of this. I know, so some examples for myself, like if I'm out for a run and I'm running by someone, I notice myself, I naturally start running faster. And I'm not trying to impress them. It could be anyone out there. It could be like an old guy, like, kids, whatever. I just naturally start running a little bit faster when I'm in the presence of others. That's why, like, if I'm ever in a competition, it's been a long time since I've been in any competitions, but, I've done a couple of mini triathlons back in the day. I always, like, had faster times during the competition because I'm running with people. Or even, like, if I'm working out at a gym and lifting weights. Once again, it's been a while for that as well. But if someone was watching me versus if I was working out in the weight room by myself, I tend to be able to lift more, right? So that'd be examples of social facilitation. Social loafing. Some of you guys are very familiar with this one. It's a tendency for people in a group to exert less effort when pooling the efforts toward a common goal. All right, so if you're in a group of people and Susie, she's going to do all the work. So you just kind of sit back and relax, right? You social loaf. I don't got to do anything. They're going to do all the work for me. And you might be the person that always does all the work because you hate doing group work because you have to do all the work because someone else is going to be social loafing. The next one, de-individuation, is the loss of self-awareness and self-restraint occurring in group situations that foster action and like being anonymous. So this is common. I always think about after the Bulls riots because I can remember when the Bulls won the championships and people started rioting, flipping over cars, looting, things like that. You kind of lose your sense of identity and do things you normally wouldn't. So pretty much after any major sports championship, you see groups doing this. I even remember not when the Cubs won the World Series, but just in 2003, I was in college and they won a playoff series, and they should have went to the World Series, but they didn't. I remember when they won that series, I went to ISU, and all of a sudden, my roommate's like, "Hey, people are gathering," and so we go outside and check it out, and you see people, they're gathering, doing whatever. You start seeing people climb, you know, poles and do all kinds of things, and then not to get into too much detail, but then I went back home, finished up my homework. It was a Sunday night. Uh, but then I read in the papers that, eventually they went running through the quad to the neighboring school, tearing down a goalpost, doing all these other crazy things that normally these people, wouldn't do. Cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance is a highly motivating state in which people have conflicting cognitions, which are thoughts, especially when their voluntary actions conflict with their attitudes. So pretty much it's just when you have conflicting thoughts, right? So think about Marines in boot camp. You're getting yelled at, but you want to be there. You're patriotic, but yet you got these people screaming at you. I have my dad was a drill sergeant in a boot camp, which I witnessed when I was a kid. Which I think I was like 8 at the time. I went to visit him one weekend, and like I could have got up and yelled at them. I was too shy to do that. But like I saw these, these Marines yelling at these people, making these guys cry, and but why are they still there, right? So they want to be there, but yet who wants to get yelled at? And then I got some videos I'll put in a playlist of some other examples of cognitive dissonance. But pretty much just any conflicting thought. So here's a great example of it, right? So you got this truck with these bumper stickers. One saying "Save the Constitution," and the other one saying "Secede." Well, do you want to stay with the U.S. and the U.S. Constitution, or do you want to leave the U.S. and the U.S. Constitution? Right? Some conflicting thoughts there. So the cognitive dissonance theory, right, proposed by Leon Festinger, says that when people's cognitions and actions are in conflict, right, a state of dissonance, they often reduce the conflict by changing their thinking to fit their behavior, right? So, when you're working out and you're in a lot of pain, you're like, what do I do? Do I keep working out? But I don't like the pain. So then, you change your way of thinking. But, the pain is just weakness leaving the body, right? It's good for me. So think about it. Can you think of any other examples of cognitive dissonance, how you eventually change your mind, you change your way of thinking so you don't have that conflict anymore? Pretty much you rationalize why you do something. Here are some examples. So the first one, smokers tend to experience cognitive dissonance because it is widely accepted that cigarettes cause lung cancer, yet virtually everyone wants to live a long and healthy life. So in terms of the theory, the desire to live a long life is dissonant with the activity of doing something that will most likely shorten one's life. So the tension produced by these contradictory ideas can be reduced by quitting smoking, denying the evidence of lung cancer, or justifying one's smoking. Right? So the theory says you got to change your way of thinking for one. Right? So an example could be like you could rationalize your behavior by concluding that, well, everyone's going to die, so cigarettes don't actually, change anything. Or a person could believe that smoking keeps one from gaining weight, which would also be unhealthy. So, growing up, I've been around, a lot of smokers in my family and stuff, and they would always rationalize it. Oh, if I quit, I'm just going to gain weight, so I might as well just keep smoking, right? Or the people, well, I'm going to die, anyway, I might as well do what I like, to die. Of course, you're probably going to die a lot earlier and in a lot more pain, but they're just rationalizing that, right? They're just changing their way of thinking so they don't have that cognitive dissonance anymore. And lastly, we have superordinate goals, which is shared goals that override differences among people and require their cooperation. All right, so I got a little video there, which obviously I can't show you on the lecture here, but I'll put in the playlist. So think about how this video represents, subordinate goals and the mere exposure effect. Right? So if you see this, think about like shared goals that override differences. So think about like the military. So you have people from all over the country coming together with a lot of different, opinions and ethnicities and religions, but yet, their shared goal of like protecting the country overrides those differences that they have. So they get along and they cooperate. And so that's just one example. You can see that a lot of examples. Think about like athletic teams and stuff like that.